Wright was born in the Norfolk village of Erpingham in 1958, one of 4 children. He grew up in a military family, living on RAF bases around the world with his father, Conrad, a retired corporal.
He's a normal child. I mean, no aggression. He's a typical boy that just wanted to play.
But family life was far from happy, and Wright's mother left when he was just 8 years old. Wright and his siblings stayed with their father, who went on to remarry.
Whilst he was living with me, there was never a problem. Never see one even. He was happy. He had little barneys, I suppose, with his stepmother at times when he weren't a bit mischievous, if you like. But it was nothing that you would sort of think about an hour later.
Steve was not a particularly bright young man, but cheery enough in his own way. Left school at 16 without any qualifications to speak of, and got a job working as a chef on the ferries which sailed from Felixstowe to the continent.
By the early 1980s, Wright had become a steward on the cruise ship, the QE2. And it was during this time he reportedly spent money on sex workers during trips to Thailand, which some experts believe may have altered his perception towards the opposite sex.
I think he's got an expectation of women. Women are there to perform a service for him, to play a particular role. They serve a function for him, and that's something that we continually see throughout the rest of his life.
He would often return home from sea penniless. The world's media descended on Ipswich, and the cameras were all pointed at the police.
I think this case was one that attracted so much attention because it was unfolding in front of our eyes. This was the era of reality television when that started to become very popular. We were seeing it as it unfolded on 24-hour rolling news, and you never knew what was going to happen from one day to the next.
Detectives told prostitutes to stay off the streets, but their warnings were largely ignored. A local news crew interviewed one of the girls anonymously.
Why have you decided to come out tonight?
Because I need the money. I need the money, you know.
Despite the dangers?
Well, that has made me a bit wary about getting into cars, you know.
But presumably you will do that tonight?
Well, probably.
The woman interviewed was Paula Clennell.
Paula Clennell, she had children, and she was always trying quite hard to change her life. You know, she was happy when saw her, you know, nice girl, but yeah, she tried quite hard, you know, to get out of it, you know, because it's a very hard thing to get out of the addiction if you still live generally in the same town. But yeah, she was trying, you know, to get away from it and change her life, bless her.
Just 6 days after that news report aired, Paula Clennell was missing. In December 2006, the police in Ipswich were under mounting pressure to catch a prolific serial killer. The bodies of 3 dead prostitutes had been found in just 10 days. They had no clues or potential suspects, and the killing wasn't about to stop. 2 more young women had gone missing. 24-year-old Paula Clennell, who'd been interviewed on the news just days before, and now police receive reports of a 5th missing woman, 29-year-old Annette Nichols, the best friend of fellow prostitute Jade Reynolds.
Annette was a girl for me that I was so humbled to know. You know, she always took time for me. She'd want to know if I was all right, if there's anything she could do. She'd do anything for anybody else. She was always well kept. She'd greet you with a smile and a happiness. You know, you felt all right when you was with Annette. I did. I could think, oh yeah, wicked. There she is, you know. It was a relief because I know that I could talk to her. She'd understand my problems. So when she went missing, that's kind of like tearing out a piece of my heart.
As the police searched for Paula and Annette, there was a macabre inevitability in the air amongst the mass of international journalists who'd gathered in Ipswich.
There was almost certainly going to be another discovery. Where was it going to be? Who was it going to be? It was nail-biting, and whilst it can't be described as fear, it was really palpable. You sensed that from the people in the town, you sensed it from your colleagues, but also from other colleagues from other media organisations and the police as well.
On December the 12th, another body was found in Levington, just a mile away from Nacton, in the same woods where Annalie Alderton had been discovered days before.
While somebody was out walking their dog, they stumbled upon the body of a fourth victim, just a few metres away from the main road in Levington. In the undergrowth, also this time not in water. Again, the DNA was important in this case. But what seemed quite strange about this one is that it almost had an appearance of a rushed approach, that this body was deposited by the side of the road, albeit a few metres off the main road. It had the appearance, or it seemed as if it had been done quickly.
The police sent a helicopter up to survey the woodland for evidence. As it circled the area, they made a further gruesome discovery. Another body was lying in the woods only 100 yards away. The naked bodies were those of the missing women, 24-year-old Paula Clennell and 29-year-old Annette Nichols.
I don't think I'll ever get back what I had with Annette, with another girl. You know, this is the most beautiful woman that I'd ever known, that had become quite important to me, that I could trust. You know, and now it's not there. I didn't go out after that. I was quite sensible, because I emotionally couldn't go out and work on the streets after Annette was found.
5 women had been murdered in Ipswich in just 6 weeks. The press had named the killer the Suffolk Strangler.
Alderton and Clennell, they were both asphyxiated. That was the cause of their death. In the other cases, the changes after death really prevented pathology giving a definitive answer, although I think it's reasonable to assume that someone who's killing 5 people in a short space of time probably used similar methods.
Interestingly, none of the 5 victims showed any sign of sexual assault. So it isn't a rape murder. It's not, oh, I've satisfied myself, now I'm going to kill you, murder. It is a targeted murder without a sexual element.
He is very much feeding off the media frenzy that's being created around his crimes. And he's increasingly feeling even more in control of what's going on. So he's changing the way that he's doing things, and he's looking at the reaction from the media when he does that, and he's absolutely loving it.
He believes he's fulfilling something. Maybe he's convinced himself that he's clearing the world of prostitutes. They're all dumped really quite close to each other. Demonstrates that he thinks he's doing something in his own fantasy world that is cleansing the world of evil, or cleansing the world of dirt, or cleansing the world of inappropriate sexual appetite. We'll never know. I don't think Wright probably knows now. All I do know is that he had to be caught because he wouldn't stop until he was.
On December the 15th, Tanya Nichols' dad, Jim Jewell, made an emotional plea for the killer to turn himself in.
Tanya has been taken by someone who needs to be found. We ask for anyone who knows this person or persons to come forward and contact the police.
With increasing pressure to make an arrest, police decided to question a local 37-year-old man.
He was identified because he had spent considerable time in a radio car talking to a radio journalist and other TV journalists.
I spent a bit of time with him to try and get to know his relationship with the girls. There was a kind of an understanding between them that you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours.
He was loosely associated as a friend of one or more of the girls who were murdered, and at that stage he became of significant interest to the inquiry. There was a very strong feeling from some of the media people present that this man was the right man and should be looked at more seriously.
With a suspect in custody, detectives received a lead from the forensics lab. The 3 bodies that were found on dry land did have DNA evidence on them. In a 1 in a billion chance, the DNA found on all 3 women was the same. But whose was it? The DNA was run through the national database and police got a match. But to their surprise, it wasn't the man they had in custody.
At that time, and as it still stands today, if a person is arrested or convicted of an indictable offence or a serious offence, they can have their DNA taken and held on the database.
The DNA matched that of a local man who'd been convicted of stealing £80 from a pub till in 2002. 48-year-old Steve Wright.
And it was that match which led to significant additional work, including then the CCTV evidence, which showed a vehicle being used by Wright moving between some of the locations around the relevant times. So he became a major suspect in the inquiry.
Over just 6 weeks, 5 prostitutes had been murdered in Ipswich. The police finally believed they'd found the killer, 48-year-old Steve Wright, whose DNA had been found on 3 of the bodies. Wright had not been a suspect at any point during the police investigation, even though he had been stopped during routine checks of the red light district. Whilst the world's media was focusing on a local man who police currently had in custody, Wright was put under surveillance. Peter Sutcliffe is one of the most infamous killers in British history. For 5 years he evaded capture while brutally murdering 13 young women across the north of England. It was an investigation with twists and turns and a case that still haunts the British public to this day.
For years, women and girls felt that simply leaving their homes at night meant taking their lives in their hands.
When Sutcliffe was eventually apprehended on January the 2nd, 1981, it brought an end to a manhunt that had both terrified and captivated the nation. The press had dubbed him the Yorkshire Ripper.
For women, it was a very frightening time, and they were stuck in this awful position of being told they shouldn't go out at night. It had an enormous social effect on the country.
As well as his 13 victims, Sutcliffe had attacked at least 7 more women. His arrest was a huge relief for the under-pressure detectives at West Yorkshire Police.
He attacked at random. We couldn't anticipate his moves. The whole of the north of England was held in a grip of terror, really, by this man. There was a sort of, I can only describe it as a Gothic-type cloud over the area.
But the Yorkshire Ripper's story begins over 70 years ago. Peter Sutcliffe was born on the 2nd of June 1946 in the market town of Bingley on the outskirts of Bradford, West Yorkshire.
He was the youngest of quite a large family. His brothers and sisters were all of strong character. They were all working class, could look after themselves. But Peter was a shy boy and very much attached to his mother.
His mother was somebody who was very much dominated and controlled by his father. So I think he had quite a lot of sympathy for his mum, and he thought the world of her as a child. But Peter was somebody who was quite shy, quite awkward, he was quite skinny and scrawny. And I don't think he ever lived up to his father's expectations. And I think that planted that seed of shame in Peter Sutcliffe that would come to shape the rest of his life.
Sutcliffe's awkward demeanour as a child manifested into a dysfunctional adulthood, demonstrated in his early career choices.
Peter Sutcliffe had a variety of different jobs throughout his life. He worked as a gravedigger for quite a period of time, and it was reported that he stole things from the corpses that he was burying. Now that suggests to me that he wasn't horrified or repulsed by dead bodies, and that's something that would be quite influential later on.
On Valentine's Day 1967, 21-year-old Sutcliffe met Sonia Shermer. The pair began a long-term relationship, eventually getting married in August 1974.
The relationship that he had with his wife, Sonia, appeared to have been a decent one, and I think he would have treated her fairly well, because she served a purpose for him. Women like his mother and his wife, he saw as carers and nurturers, people who would look after him. Other women, I think he saw somewhat differently. I think Peter Sutcliffe's view of women is very black and white. They are either Madonnas or they are whores. So they're either these perfect domestic angels or they're these sinful creatures.
These opposing views on women collided with one another when a family revelation dramatically altered 23-year-old Sutcliffe's world. His mother, whom he'd looked up to as a child, had been unfaithful.
His mother had had an affair with a policeman, and his father had decided to confront his wife at a hotel where she was meeting this particular man, and took Peter with him.
Peter's father basically humiliated her and said, look, I know all about what's going on, and the children found out as well. So I think this kind of further cemented ideas as to what women were, what could be expected of them, always to be cautious and wary of them.
I think there was every possibility that after seeing his mother and seeing what happened, that possibly preyed on his mind and affected his attitude towards women.
Sutcliffe began to visit the red light districts of Yorkshire and find solace in prostitutes. But his feelings for these women would soon lead to violence and eventually murder. On the morning of October the 30th, 1975, just 12 miles away in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, the body of 28-year-old Wilma McCann was discovered in a local park.
Wilma McCann was a Scottish woman who had come down to Yorkshire. She was working as a prostitute. She was very hard up, and it was very difficult for her because she had young children, young family to support. And I think that was the only way she felt she could get enough money.
The attack on Wilma McCann set in motion what would become a clear pattern and regular method of ambush by the killer.
His modus operandi was to use a ball-peen hammer and was to strike them very hard and very fast on the back of the head so they fell unconscious. He used his hammer and hit her over the back of the head, and then he stabbed her 15 times in the neck, chest and abdomen.
But the police were no closer to catching the killer, and 3 months later, on the 20th of January 1976, another woman was murdered in Leeds. 42-year-old wife and mother Emily Jackson, who'd vanished after a night out at her local pub. Emily's son Neil was 17 years old at the time. He remembers receiving the tragic news on that fateful morning.
I've come downstairs. My dad's loading one of the vans up for work, and I'm getting my boots on ready for going to work and having a pot of tea, when they were knocking at the door and it opened the police. And that's when I first knew. And it first knew when, like I said for Dad, when the police knocked at the door. I can still remember it plain as day.
Again, a hammer had been used in the brutal attack. Emily had also been stabbed a total of 52 times with a screwdriver. Like Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson had been working as a prostitute to make ends meet.
It was just to help the family in dire straits, is what I've been told afterwards. When family were in hard times work-wise, she went elsewhere, but I didn't realise till well after.
This time, police were able to recover from the scene a key piece of evidence. On Emily's right thigh was a very firm and visible footprint from a size 7 Wellington boot.
For some inexplicable reason, he stamped on her thigh with such force that it left an imprint of the sole of his boot on her thigh. Now, police tried to trace that boot, or the manufacturers of the boot, which they did, and then try and find out people who had bought them, but it didn't come to anything.
Once again, the trail went cold. It was over a year until a murder with a familiar MO took place in Leeds. On the morning of February the 5th, 1977, the body of 28-year-old Irene Richardson was discovered. She'd been savagely murdered, another prostitute killed with a hammer. West Yorkshire police were suddenly dealing with a serial killer. What they didn't realise is that this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most infamous series of murders in British history. Less than 3 months after the death of a third victim, Irene Richardson, the killer struck again. On the night of the 23rd of April 1977, 32-year-old prostitute Patricia Atkinson became victim number 4. She was murdered in her own flat, this time not in Leeds, but in nearby Bradford.
She believed that if she invited customers into her flat, she was safe because all the killings had taken place in isolated parks or back alleys. So she thought she was safe, but she wasn't.
The killer hit Patricia 4 times around the head with a hammer and then mutilated her body with a knife. This time detectives found a clue to link the murders of Patricia Atkinson and Emily Jackson.
The police found the same boot mark on the bedclothes at Patricia's house, Patricia's flat, as they'd found on Emily Jackson's thigh.
This crucial link confirmed the authorities' worst fears. The killer was expanding his hunting ground and he seemed to have a favoured target. All 4 murder victims had been working as prostitutes. On the 17th of November 1980 in Leeds, Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student, was hit over the head, stabbed repeatedly and mutilated. An attack that bore all the hallmarks of the Ripper. But Jacqueline Hill would be Peter Sutcliffe's final victim. Within 2 months, a routine police stop would lead to one of the most sensational arrests of modern times. The capture of the Yorkshire Ripper.
Just after New Year, or January 2nd, 1981, Peter went to Sheffield and picked up a prostitute. On the same evening, a policeman with a lot of years of service decided to show a young rookie round Sheffield.
The 2 police officers spotted Sutcliffe's car near offices on Melbourne Avenue in Sheffield's red light district. They decided to approach and talk to the pair.
The cops asked, what's your girlfriend's name? He said, I don't know, we've only just met. And the policeman said, you know, I haven't just fallen off a Christmas tree. So he already realised there was something odd going on.
Peter said that he needed to urinate, and the officers let him go up to a wall by the side of the building. While he was away, the young police officer did a PNC check on the registration of the car and found that the plates were false. So Peter was arrested and taken to Dewsbury Police Station.
Once down at the station, Sutcliffe was searched. He wasn't carrying any weapons, but this time detectives weren't going to let him slip from their grasp.
So one of them thought, let's go back to that place where we spotted him and let's see if he did leave anything when he popped out of the car saying he was going to have a pee.
The police returned to the scene of the original arrest.
They found the hammer, the intended murder weapon, and they came back with them. And gradually after that, Peter Sutcliffe realised that the game was up, and eventually he confessed. And his only condition was that he be allowed to tell his wife, Sonia, before it became known to the general public that he was indeed the Yorkshire Ripper.
It had been over 5 years since the murder of Wilma McCann, but detectives finally had the Ripper in custody. Fred and Rose's horrifying story began many years before. In 1969, 28-year-old Fred West was married to his wife Rena with a young family of his own. But he had his eye on a 15-year-old girl named Rosemary Letts. Rose and her family had recently moved to the Gloucestershire area, whereas Fred was born and raised in the local village of Muchmarkle.
Well, Fred was the eldest boy in the family, and he was very much the target for quite a lot of abuse at the hands of his mother. So his mother sexually abused him, essentially, and he lost his virginity to her. And the family was a very self-contained one. Rose's childhood was similar to Fred's in many ways, in that it was completely dysfunctional and antisocial and abnormal. So she was abused by her father, who started raping her from a very young age. So what she took to be normal, what she took to be acceptable in terms of behaviour within a family really was anything but.
Fred pursued Rose. He was used to getting what he wanted. When the couple met, there was instant attraction.
Rose lived in the same village that Fred had a caravan. They met at the bus station in Cheltenham. She said that he could charm the birds off the trees, even though his appearance was shabby. He had not very clean teeth.
Well, these were two incredibly damaged people. They'd both come from abnormal families, and I think when they met, what they saw in each other was something familiar. So they both would have realised that the childhoods that they had were far from normal, but with one another, they felt that familiarity.
Maybe it was something that Rose gave off implicitly, but something in Fred connected with what had happened to Rose and the way she was and the way she'd been treated by her father. And it was like a union of two souls.
I think it was the perfect storm. The chances of these two people meeting was, it must have been a million to one, but unfortunately they did.
By 1970, just a year after meeting, they were living together in Gloucester with Fred's stepdaughter Charmaine. His wife Rena was nowhere to be seen. Rose was pregnant with the couple's first daughter, Heather.
I think in the early days, perhaps the more dominant partner was Fred. He was older, he was more experienced, he'd seen more than Rose had. She'd come from this incredibly contained family. But I think as their relationship developed, she started to find her feet and find her confidence. And I don't think that Fred ever really trusted her.
For Rose and Fred, it was all about sex from the very, very beginning. Fred was the originator, but he found the perfect sorcerer's apprentice, the perfect partner, someone who shared his lust and someone who understood him and wanted to perform for him.
I think we have a lot of trouble making sense of Fred and Rose's relationship, and the reason for that is because we are people with emotions and normal feelings and ideas of what acceptable and unacceptable boundaries are around relationships. So I don't think I'd describe their relationship as a loving one.
Fred and Rose's traumatic childhoods had a lasting effect on the couple and their twisted approach to family life together. 2 decades later, it's 1992 and Gloucestershire police are searching for Heather West. In 1987, aged just 16, Fred and Rose's eldest child vanished from the family home. Fred had claimed Heather had run away, but she was never reported as missing. But after receiving allegations of child abuse at 25 Cromwell Street, detectives began to look into Heather's whereabouts. Chief Constable Tony Butler was in charge of Gloucestershire Police.
One of the children told a friend at school about what was happening to her. That friend talked to a patrolling police officer, in fact, about what her friend had told her, and it was a result of what the police officer then took that back, and it initiated a child protection process which led to the evidence being gathered.
5 of the West children were placed into care and the police began their investigations. They were interviewed about the darker side of their lives at 25 Cromwell Street.
What it brought to light was a family joke. And the family joke was a simple one. You better watch out, because if you don't shut up and stop causing your dad or your mum any trouble, you'll end up like Heather, 2 down and 3 across in the patio. Fred had laid a patio behind Cromwell Street, was in squares, which was rather like a crossword. The family joke was that he'd buried Heather at 2 down and 3 across.
This issue, this Heather's under the patio, continued to be raised. And so we started to take this point seriously. We knew Heather had disappeared, had left the home, so we tried to trace her. And despite massive amount of inquiry to try and find her, she just literally disappeared off the face of the earth.
In February 1994, the police decided to find out if the family joke was more serious than the children realised. Armed with a warrant, they began to dig under the patio of 25 Cromwell Street.
When they arrived with the warrant, Fred and Rose were at the house and they went into the back garden and the officers started digging the garden.
Sensing the end was nigh, Fred asked to be interviewed by police.
Fred asked the officer if they could go down to the police station, and so they left. Fred said that he admitted that Heather's remains were in the garden, but the police were looking in the wrong place. And later that day, he returned with the officers and he indicated where he thought Heather was buried. The following day, officers digging in that area recovered a femur, and that was taken for examination by the forensic pathologist, who confirmed it was human remains. and that turned out to be one of Heather's remains.
Rose was being questioned at Cheltenham police station when the news reached her and her solicitor, Leo Goatley.
When Rose was told that Heather's remains had been found, she gasped loudly and was very distraught. How do you interpret that? Was that a mother's shock and distress, or was it a murderer's distress at being found out? At that time, I believed that she was shocked and distressed, and that she didn't know the extent of Fred's activities. And of course, at that stage, it wasn't about serial killing, it was about Heather. But of course, the thing unravelled pretty quickly with the excavation.
The police found more than they'd bargained for under the patio at 25 Cromwell Street.
When they found remains, they found not just 2 legs or 2 thigh bones, but 3. The interrogating detective said to West, well, unless Heather had 3 legs, there's another body. Ah, yes, Fred says, without drawing breath or hesitating. That must be the other girl, that'll be Shirley.
The police were about to unearth all the secrets that Fred and Rose West had been hiding at 25 Cromwell Street for over 2 decades. Secrets that would shock the entire nation. On March the 5th, 1994, the world's media had descended upon the home of Fred and Rose West in Gloucester. Police had exhumed 3 bodies from their back garden: their daughter Heather, Fred's pregnant lover Shirley Robinson, and missing teenager Alison Chambers. Now detectives were moving their search inside the property and began excavating the cellar at 25 Cromwell Street.
We started the excavations in the cellar. It was a difficult place to do excavations, and we had to be very careful about recovering the bodies. And on the first day, we did find 2 sets of human remains. One turned out to be Teresa Siegenthaler, and the second remains were Shirley Hubbard.
It was clear to pathologists that much had been done to try and hide the identity of all the murdered girls.
With Fred and Rose as victims, one of their hallmarks, as it were, was that the fingers and toes were removed. I think we can hypothesize that there may be different reasons for that. Simple cruelty would be one. But obviously, most people know that fingerprints are a very good way to identify somebody. So removing them, particularly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, before DNA technology was really recognised, would be a way to limit the chances of that person being identified.
And that was one of the big, one of our difficulties when we were doing the investigation, trying to identify the human remains, and in particular Teresa's remains, because there was no evidence she'd been anywhere near Gloucestershire. But we were able to, in liaison with the Metropolitan Police and the missing persons, to come down to a sort of a short list of people that it could be, and then through using forensic techniques we were able to be satisfied that we had identified her remains.
As the cellar excavation continued, officers escorted Fred to a field near his home at Muchmarkle. He told them if they dug there, they'd find the body of his first wife, Rena, not seen since 1971, a year after Fred and Rose had moved in together. Rena and Fred had been married for 9 years, but she was never reported missing.
So he was taken out to the fields, and he pointed out in one field, fairly close to a hedge line, where he said that he'd buried Rena Costello.
There were now 6 victims, and back in the cellar at Cromwell Street, even more bodies were being exhumed. Juanita Mott, a former lodger at the house, missing since 1975. And Carol Cooper, last seen walking home from the cinema in 1973. Plus 2 familiar names the police had been looking out for, Lucy Partington, and buried under the family bathroom, Linda Goff.
This was a tragedy for these young women. I mean, all murders are tragic for the victims and their families, but it was the scale of this, I think, that took the media's attention. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible that 2 people could abduct young women or lure them to their house and subsequently, sexually abuse them and then kill them. I mean, it is on a scale that's almost incomprehensible.
By the 8th of March 1994, less than 2 weeks after beginning their search at Cromwell Street, police had found 10 victims. Most of them had been buried 2 decades ago, when Fred and Rose were at their most prolific. One of Britain's most prolific serial killers. Over the course of 5 years, during the late 1970s and early 80s, he killed at least 12 men, confessing to as many as 15, the majority of whom have never been identified. Nilsen thought his crimes were simply being flushed from existence by dissecting the bodies piece by piece, boiling them, and then disposing of them down the toilet. But a routine drain inspection at his London home in 1983 would lead to his downfall.
We found a number of interesting items which can only be established once pathologists has examined it.
Are you satisfied that they are in fact human bodies?
This is a possibility, yes.
Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on the 23rd of November 1945 in Fraserburgh, Scotland. He spent the early years of his life in this house. According to his mother, he was a quiet boy. Little, if anything, marked him out from the ordinary.
After his parents' marriage broke down, he spent the majority of his childhood living in the nearby village of Stricken.
His father was largely absent. He grew up with his mother and his siblings and his grandparents, and his family reformed and his mother remarried. So he had a lot of disruption, he had a lot of chaos. But lots of children have that.
He was isolated from an early age, and the isolation found solace in representations of people who weren't alive, like pictures in a storybook. He'd cut the picture out and take it home. That's what he liked, because that picture couldn't argue with him. It couldn't say no to him.
His mother has actually talked about the way that she would cuddle and have, physical warmth with her other children, but she felt repelled by Dennis. She was quite cold towards him. And this was even when he was just a little child. So right from the beginning, he's learning from his mum that he's different and that he's kind of repulsive in a way.
Due to the absence of his father and the distant relationship with his mother, Nilsen grew particularly close to his grandfather, who worked as a North Sea fisherman.
When he came back from sea, the grandfather would take him down to the beach, and they'd walk up and down the beach, and he'd tell him stories of what happened at sea. His grandfather was the one person he could relate to. This was the one tactile relationship he had, the only person who touched him.
But in 1951, Nilsen lost the one family member that he looked up to the most.
I firmly hold to this view that the death of his grandfather profoundly affected him.
His mother kind of skirted around the topic and said, your grandfather's just not very well and he'll be back. And then when the funeral came around and the body was laid out in the front room of the house, as it often is in these communities at this time, he kind of thought his grandfather was just asleep. So you've got this really traumatic event going on in his life, and he's really struggling to make sense of what's going on. And he's feeling pretty rejected, really, because he's got this really close relationship with his grandfather. One minute he's there and one minute he's not.
I'm utterly convinced that his idea of death and his idea of love were fused at that point. And after that, he could only love people who were dead.
On December the 29th, 1978, he met a 14-year-old boy called Stephen Holmes, and Nilsen knew there was only one way to guarantee his latest lover would never be able to leave him.
Stephen Holmes was a very young boy, and he was trying to get himself something to drink at a pub in Cricklewood. Nilsen offered to help out with the drink and then brought him back to his flat.
Stephen Holmes was never seen again. In a desperate attempt to stop him from leaving, Nilsen murdered the 14-year-old boy by strangling him with a tie before drowning him in a bucket of water. It was the beginning of a familiar pattern for Nilsen.
Essentially, he would frequent the gay pubs and gay bars and would meet men that he found attractive. He would meet men that he wanted to form relationships with, and they would go back to Nilsen's place.
His chosen victims, not necessarily all homosexual, but all vulnerable, I think you could say, or susceptible to somebody offering them a bit of comfort or a meal or a drink or whatever. But he obviously had a tendency to go for handsome young men or people who made themselves available to at least just hang out with him for a while.
But he didn't have the social skills to maintain a normal relationship at a normal pace in a way that wouldn't send people running for the hills. So the only way to keep people there was to kill them.
With Stephen, Nilsen initiated what would go on to become a familiar ritual for him.
The modus operandi of Dennis Nilsen was very similar for most of his victims. They would be plied with drink.
He would have a tie. By the time the victim was now drunk, almost comatose, going to sleep, he would put the tie round his neck and strangle him that way.
And if they were unconscious but not dead, then he would drown them in a bath or a bucket.
After that, he would get himself a drink, light a cigarette, and then spend the next few hours looking after the body.
He would get them out and he would sit and watch television with them. He would clean up the bodies.
He would clean it, dry it, dress it, put it comfortably in a chair. He would speak to the corpse in the chair. These were his pretend friends.
So what we've got going on here, there isn't like massive sexual depravity. What he was creating was a picture of domesticity. He would sit there and watch television with them. So he's killing for company, but in the most grotesque way.
It sounds in many ways like a very dark horror film, the way that he behaved. And I think that was part of the fascination with him, which exists to this day.
Dennis Nilsen's murderous career would continue undetected for 5 years.
I think one of the reasons Dennis Nilsen got away with it for so long was that even at that time, which is post the legalization of homosexuality, the disappearance of young men who were gay was not treated with the same amount of respect and energy as the police, I think, would treat it nowadays.
By February 1983, 37-year-old Nilsen had moved home and was living in a top-floor flat on Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, North London. After residents complained about the drains being blocked, a plumber was called in to investigate.
And they found what looked like bits of flesh. Nilsen suggested that could be somebody had flushed their Kentucky Fried Chicken out or something like that, and that would be the explanation for little bones and flesh.
But the plumber wasn't so sure, and the following morning, February the 9th, 1983, he called the police. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. remembers that day well.
My phone rang, and it was Peter Slade, the uniform inspector in charge that particular day. And he said to me, "Could you possibly come up here?" He said, "I've got a bit of a problem. I'm not sure what I've got, but I'd like you to see it." And he showed me a drain with an inspection plate cover open. And he pointed out that some bits of flesh had been hauled out of the drain at the bottom. So I said, well, let's have another haul around inside the drain, get anything else that's in there. And the scenes of crime officer that I had with me managed to pull out 3 or 4 pieces of flesh, each about 4 inches long, 1 inch wide, and 3 little bones with a knuckle at each end. And when I looked at them, I thought these bones had probably come from a human hand.
Peter took the remains to Charing Cross Hospital, where resident pathologist Professor David Bowen confirmed their suspicions.
He said it's human, and he said, by pure luck, you've brought me a piece of neck, off the neck, and your victim's been strangled. He said there's a clear ligature mark on this piece of flesh.
Most of us think of hair as being hair, but different parts of the body, the hair is quite different when you look at it down the microscope. And so the pathologist in the Nilsen case was identifying that this piece of skin had hair that fitted with being from someone's neck. So despite the difficulties of fragments of tissue being found in a situation like a drain, identifying the characteristic ligature mark on it it's pointing you very strongly towards strangulation.
And I looked at him and I said, "You sure you've not been watching too much TV, Prof?" And he said, "No, it's as clear as a bell." He said, "This is human." So that only meant one thing to me, that somebody must have been murdered and flushed down the toilet.
Astounded, Peter drove back to Cranley Gardens and waited outside the flat all day until Nilsen returned home from work.
My first introductory words to him were, "I'm Detective Chief Inspector J from Hornsey Police Station. I've come about your drains." And he looked at me and he said, "Since when have police been interested in blocked drains?" I said, "Well, you take me up in your flat and I'll tell you." And you could smell immediately the decomposing flesh. I said to him, "Look, your drains were blocked with human remains." And he looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, how awful." And I just pushed my face a little bit nearer to his and said, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" And he said, "Okay, it's in plastic bags in the front bedroom." Even at that point, his demeanour didn't change at all. He was just as he was when he came in the front door. He was okay. Maybe the game's up. And he was relaxed about it. So we walked him down to the car. I told him I was arresting him. So I drove the car back, and then Steve McCusker was obviously thinking to himself about all the body parts that were in so many different bags. And he popped the question to Nilsen, "Are we talking here about one body or two?" And Nilsen said neither. He said, "I think it's 15 or 16. And I can remember the steering wheel sort of shaking in my hands.